All right, so today we're going deep on some of Plato's thoughts on poetry and rhetoric, and those two might not seem like the most obvious pairing, but stick with us here. Plato brings them together in some pretty mind-blowing ways.
Yeah.
We got some excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy to help us unpack all this. So get ready for some ancient Greek wisdom that's surprisingly relevant even today.
For sure.
So let's start with the Ion.
Okay.
This dialogue features Ion, who is a rhapsode, basically kind of like a rock star performer of poetry, especially when it comes to Homer.
Right.
Think of him like a total super fan traveling around giving these dramatic recitations of the Iliad and the Odyssey.
And what makes Ion so interesting is that he's not just a performer. He actually believes he's a total expert on Homer.
Yeah.
Like, he really grasps all the poet's deepest meanings and can even explain them to others, almost like a modern-day influencer who's built a following around interpreting, one specific artist's work.
Oh, I like that comparison.
Yeah.
That's a good one. And so that's where Socrates comes in.
Yeah.
Right, our favorite intellectual gadfly.
Of course.
He's always there to challenge Ion on this whole expertise claim.
Right.
What follows is just classic Socrates really getting to the heart of what it even means to understand a work of art.
It's a good one.
Yeah.
So Socrates starts out by pointing out that if Ion really understands Homer, then he must also understand everything that Homer writes about, right? Things like warfare, leadership, human nature, even the gods.
Right.
He would need to be able to judge how true Homer's claims are and even compare them to what other poets have said about these same topics.
Okay, that's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder if anyone can ever truly be an expert on art without also being an expert on all the stuff it depicts.
Right, and Socrates really doesn't let Ion off the hook here.
No.
He keeps pushing him further, forcing him to confront this choice. Either admit you don't have this vast knowledge or try to defend your expertise in front of people who actually do know about these things.
Can you imagine the pressure?
I know, right?
So how does Ion even try to get out of this?
Well, he offers this really fascinating, if a little slippery escape route, divine inspiration.
Oh.
He claims that both he and Homer are basically vessels of the divine. So they're not speaking from, their own knowledge, but from a kind of divine madness.
Whoa. Okay, hold on. This is where things get really interesting. This divine inspiration argument.
It's
tricky, right?
It is.
On the one hand, it seems to elevate the poet to this almost mystical status, like they're channeling the gods.
Right.
But on the other hand, doesn't it kind of diminish their role at the same time, suggesting they're just mouthpieces for something beyond their control?
It's such a brilliant move by Plato because he presents us with this paradox and forces us to really grapple with some pretty fundamental questions about creativity and knowledge and, even the role of the divine in human life.
Right.
I mean, if artists are simply vessels, does that mean they have no responsibility for what their work contains?
Right.
Can we even praise or blame them for what they create?
Exactly. And just when you think Ion might have escaped Socrates' scrutiny, he throws in another curveball, leaving Ion with this really provocative choice. Either embrace the label divine and accept that you're not speaking from knowledge, or admit that you're just a human being like Socrates himself, struggling to grasp at wisdom.
And if we try to connect this back to Plato's bigger philosophical project, it seems like he's kind of subtly hinting at this key difference between poetry and philosophy.
Right.
Poetry, even when it's divinely inspired, might not be grounded in knowledge or reason, while philosophy is all about that rigorous pursuit of truth through dialogue and questioning.
I see. So even in the Ion, we see these seeds of tension between philosophy and poetry. The Plato's going to explore much more fully later on, but I kind of want to hear from you. What do you think about this whole divine inspiration argument? Does it make sense?
Yeah.
And is it even possible to truly appreciate and understand art without knowing something about what it's depicting or exploring?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's something that so picking up on that tension you mentioned between philosophy and poetry when we get to the Republic, Plato's concerns about poetry sort of shift from the individual to more like the societal level.
Okay.
It's not just about one rhapsode's expertise anymore. It's about poetry's power to shape the whole fabric of a city, especially laws and education.
Right, because in the Republic, Socrates is busy designing his ideal city, his utopia.
Exactly.
And everything is carefully considered, from what the Guardians learn to the very stories that people hear.
Right. And that's where poetry really comes under the microscope. Remember that chain of inspiration idea from the Ion?
Yeah.
Well, in the Republic, Plato takes that idea even further, arguing that mimetic poetry, meaning poetry based on imitation can be really dangerous.
Okay.
He thinks the stories we hear, especially as kids, have this huge impact on our souls. They shape our values and beliefs and ultimately our actions.
So it's not just entertainment, it's like formation.
Exactly. And for the right kind of formation, Socrates lays out some pretty strict criteria for acceptable poetry in this ideal city.
Uh-oh.
So first, the gods have to be portrayed truthfully, which for Plato means they must be unchanging, purely good, and incapable of deception.
And this is where we see this big clash between Plato's philosophy
Mm.
and those traditional Greek myths, right?
Exactly.
I mean, you think of the gods in Homer. They're passionate, they're messy, they get jealous, they get angry, even deceitful sometimes.
Yeah.
Plato wants to banish those kinds of stories from his perfect city because they paint this false and potentially harmful picture of what the divine is.
Right. He's worried that if we see these flawed portrayals of the gods, we might start to think it's okay for us to be flawed too, that we might be tempted to copy their bad behavior.
So it's not just theological accuracy, it's moral education.
Precisely, and Plato's worries go beyond just the gods. Socrates also goes after stories where heroes are like lamenting their fate or giving in to too much grief. He even says poetry should always show justice leading to happiness because he's worried that if we hear stories about good people suffering unjustly or bad people getting away with stuff, we might start to doubt that justice is even good.
It's pretty radical to want to censor so many classic stories that were such a big part of Greek culture.
It is radical, but it shows just how deeply Plato is concerned about the persuasive power of art. He believes that poetry can kind of bypass our rational minds and speak straight to our emotions, planting these seeds that could grow into bad beliefs or behaviors.
See.
He has this great example about watching a tragedy. He says even the best of us might enjoy seeing a portrayal of suffering on stage, but he worries that that enjoyment makes us more likely to give in to grief or despair in our own lives, almost like we're practicing negative emotions by engaging with art.
So it's not just what the stories are about. It's the form two tragedy by its nature is about suffering and loss, and Plato worries that can have a desensitizing effect.
Right, and this connects to another key idea in Platomimesis, or imitation, he thinks. By imitating negative characters, even in fiction, we risk establishing harmful habits in our souls, like we're blurring the lines between what's fake and what's real, letting those bad traits seep into our own character.
It makes me think about the role models we see in movies, TV shows, video games.
Mhm.
Are we absorbing values and behaviors just by watching characters do them? It feels super relevant even today, not just for ancient Greek poetry.
Absolutely. Plato would totally want us to be asking these questions about the media we consume.
I think he would.
And to understand his concerns even more, we need to dig into another idea, the tripartite schema.
Okay.
So Plato believes there are three levels of reality. First, there are the forms or ideas. These are like the true eternal essences of things like justice, beauty, goodness.
Okay.
Then there are the artifacts we make in the world, tables, chairs, whatever, which are imperfect copies of those forms.
Right.
And finally, there are the imitations of those artifacts made by poets, which are even further removed from the truth.
So poets are like shadow puppeteers, creating illusions that distract us from the real forms.
In a way, yes. And just like we can be fooled by a really well-done trompe-l'oeil painting, Plato thinks we can be fooled by the persuasive power of poetry. It might seem like it's giving us deep truths, but really it's just seductive illusions.
Which is why he's so concerned about it misleading us, especially about morality and virtue.
Exactly. And this brings us to another important dialogue, the Gorgias here. Plato shifts his focus from poetry to rhetoric more broadly, which he sees as including poetry.
Interesting.
The Gorgias has this heated debate between Socrates and the sophists, these skilled rhetoricians, who are often more interested in winning arguments and finding the truth.
That's intense.
It gets pretty intense, some real philosophical fireworks.
Okay, I'm hooked. What are some of the key clashes we see in the Gorgias? Okay, so we see how suspicious Plato was of poetry and rhetoric, like especially in the Republic, where he's setting the rules for his ideal city. But is there any room for a more positive view of these arts in his philosophy? I mean, is all rhetoric bad? Is all poetry dangerous? That's where I'm kind of getting tripped up.
That's a great question, and it seems like it's one that Plato himself was wrestling with. When we get to the Phaedrus, we see a really interesting shift. It's not just about, tearing down false persuasion anymore. Instead, the dialogue explores this possibility of a true art of rhetoric, one that's based on knowledge and ethics and a deep understanding of the human soul.
So it's almost like he's trying to redeem rhetoric, showing that it can be a good thing in the world.
Well, remember, Socrates himself was a master of rhetoric, even though he often downplayed it. And the Phaedrus really shows off that mastery. It's filled with these amazing speeches, vivid images, even a mythical story about the soul's journey, all woven together to persuade us, the readers, of the power of philosophical rhetoric.
Mhm.
It's pretty meta when you think about it.
Yeah, it is. Okay, so walk me through this. How does the Phaedrus make the case for a more positive view of rhetoric?
It starts with Phaedrus reciting a speech by Lysias, this well-known orator. But Socrates isn't impressed. He criticizes it for not having a clear structure and for prioritizing persuasion over truth. So then Socrates gives his own speeches showing the difference between just being eloquent and truly artful rhetoric. He says, a good speech should be like a living beam with a head and body and limbs all working together.
I love that image, but it's about more than just how it looks, right? There's a deeper point here.
For sure, Socrates is saying that true rhetoric needs more than just knowledge of the subject and skillful composition. The most important thing is a deep understanding of the human soul. Remember the tripartite schema from the Republic?
Yeah.
Well, here in the Phaedrus, the soul is front and center. Socrates says that to really persuade someone, you have to know the different types of souls, what motivates them, how they're affected by different kinds of speech. It's like a psychology puzzle, trying to figure out what makes people tick and how to tailor your message to their deepest desires and beliefs.
So it's not manipulation or tricks, it's about genuine connection and understanding? But doesn't this go against what Socrates said in their Gorgias about rhetoric just being a kind of flattery? How do we make sense of these two views?
That's where this idea of philosophical rhetoric comes in. Socrates suggests that only a philosopher, someone who's dedicated their life to pursuing truth and understanding reality, can really have this deep knowledge of the soul. So true rhetoric for Plato is philosophical rhetoric. It's not about winning arguments no matter what. It's about using language to guide people toward truth and goodness.
Okay, I get it. But what about poetry? Remember, Plato lumped poetry and rhetoric together in the Gorgias. Does the Phaedrus have a better view of poetry too?
That's where things get a little more tricky. While the Phaedrus doesn't exactly take back Plato's earlier criticisms of poetry, it does bring back the idea of divine inspiration, suggesting that some poetry might be good. Socrates talks about four kinds of divine madness: prophetic madness, ritualistic madness, poetic madness, and the madness of love. And he even suggests that the madness of love, which is tied to pursuing beauty and truth, is the best one of all.
That's a really interesting twist. So is Plato saying that some poets might actually be channeling higher truths through their work?
Maybe, but there's a catch. Even though Socrates praises poetic inspiration when he ranks different kinds of lives, poets are pretty low down, just above laborers, sophists, and tyrants.
Ouch, that's not exactly a glowing review.
Yeah, it seems Plato still has some doubts about poetry, even in its most inspired form. Maybe he's worried that it can lead us astray too easily, grabbing our emotions while hiding the truth, or maybe he's just being provocative, making us think critically about art's role in our lives.
It does make you wonder about Plato's own dialogues. They're so well written, full of imagery and myths and even funny moments. Aren't they a kind of poetry themselves?
That's a question scholars have been debating for centuries, and it's even more interesting because of Socrates' famous criticism of writing in the Phaedrus. He says that writing is a bad form of rhetoric because it can't answer questions, it can be easily misunderstood, and it can spread lies really far. It's almost like Plato is criticizing his own work.
Wow, that is so meta. So after all this exploring Plato's dialogues, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
I think Plato wants us to be careful, readers and listeners, to be cautious of how powerful words can be and to always try to tell the difference between real knowledge and just persuasion. He makes us think critically about how the stories we hear, the art we experience, and the rhetoric we face every day shape us and our understanding of the world.
It's like he's saying we need to be active participants in the world of ideas, not just passively taking it all in.
Exactly. And maybe the biggest lesson from Plato's dialogues is that the search for truth is a lifelong journey, one that needs constant questioning, critical thinking, and a willingness to challenge our own assumptions.
And for everyone listening, we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this old debate between philosophy, poetry, and rhetoric? Was Plato too hard on poetry? Is there a way to bring these seemingly opposite forces together? And most importantly, how do you handle the constant flow of information and persuasion in your own life? Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.